Kris Perry is Executive Director of Children and Screens, a nonprofit organization working to support interdisciplinary research, inform and educate the public, influence sound public policy for child health and wellness, and enhance human capital in the field of digital wellness. Kris most recently served as Senior Advisor to Governor Gavin Newsom of California and Deputy Secretary of the California Health and Human Services Agency, where she led the development of the California Master Plan for Early Learning and Care and the expansion of access to high-quality early childhood programs. She led systems change efforts at the local, state, and national levels in her roles as Executive Director of First 5 San Mateo, First 5 California, and of the First 5 Years Fund, where she worked to protect children, improve early learning programs, and support low-income students. Thank you so much, Kris, for your time today.
Great to be here.
So the first thing I want to ask you about, and I want to focus in on the research and studies today because that's such a big part of your work at Children and Screens. So at Children and Screens, you support your work with studies surrounding children from birth all the way up to age 18. So what does the latest research reveal about infants and toddlers? Let's start with the youngest of the group, using screen technology and its effect on early childhood development.
I would love to start with early childhood. It's near and dear to my heart. Early childhood is a period of such rapid development in all domains that every interaction and exposure matters.
Yeah.
So, for example, what interactions are happening with others, such as caregivers, peers, and siblings, and what's going on in the environment, and what children are actively doing themselves are all going to have effects, positive and negative. So, thinking through this lens, it's essential to always consider the timing of digital media exposure, the type of digital media interaction, and the other activities that may be displaced. So before we launch into the screens, I want to take a step back for a moment and discuss two important considerations in early childhood. Because infants are just beginning to learn about themselves and the world around them, the most critical type of interaction is what we call serve and return. And this means that when a baby does something, babbling, for example, they're looking for a response from the environment around them. Attention or a verbal response from a caregiver, perhaps. That return is a critical moment as the baby is gaining direct feedback as a result of their engagement. So even in the most basic interactions, a smile that's returned, the baby is learning important lessons about social cues, relationships, and interactions that will become the foundation of all social and cognitive learning in the future. So infants and toddlers also rely on hands-on interactive experiences to learn about their world. Young children are not yet capable of complex, abstract thoughts like you and I are. Instead, they use all of their senses to experience their world firsthand, to test these expectations and learn about cause and effect. So I'll take a little bit of time to talk about these two important needs because I think they can help us all understand exactly why screens have limited benefits for really young children. And depending on what they're watching and what's being displaced, there can actually be negative impacts. Research has found that increased screen time in early childhood can result in reduced language development, lower executive function skills, difficulties with working memory, attention and concentration, behavioral problems, and poor social emotional development. These studies are often based on general screen time, but we also know that the most common screen activity for children under 5 is watching television. So TV is not able to offer the important serve and return responses I talked about a minute ago, or those hands-on interactions that children really need to develop. Apps may offer some interactive experiences, but still do not represent concrete, real-world dynamics that young children need to explore. High-paced, high-speed, high-paced screen activities also introduce something we'll talk about in a minute, the association with a dopamine reward system in the
Yeah.
brain that can lead to later problematic use.
That that's amazing, and I love that you started it with the important parts of development, because that's really what this is all about. And from my understanding, the studies that have come out, including the most recent one from last year, which I think you're referencing about the developmental delays, um, they're absolutely connected to what you talked about with the serve and return, but also the tangible stuff, the fine motor skills, those other things that aren't being developed because you're not using those parts of your body, right? You're just passively sitting.
Right.
So
They're being
um,
displaced. Yeah.
exactly.
Hmm.
Okay, cool. So let's jump to a little bit older kids. So let's talk about preschool age children. I know you touched on TV a little bit. So we started with infants and toddlers, and there's clear research showing developmental delays, which you outlined. But let's talk about best practices now. So, what are the best practices of parents for preschool age children as it relates to media consumption? You touched on high pace, so maybe that would be a jumping off point for maybe some rules of thumb for parents.
Absolutely. You're picking up on that theme, and you're going to hear it throughout my
Yeah.
discussion with you. But there are three major things to keep in mind as you're trying to figure out the best way to help support your child in a digital world. One is less is more.
Yeah.
Two, be prepared. And three, co-view and co-play. And I'll break these out a little bit. But before I do, I think it's also important to remind the audience here, do your best. It's
Yep.
not always going to be easy, but have patience with yourself and your little one. So let's talk a little bit first about less is more. Before 18 months of age, no screen time, with the exception of video chatting, because that allows for serve and return
Hmm.
and a connection with loved ones. Those are great things. Until 2 years of age, screen time should be very, very limited, restricted only to high quality educational content or video chatting, and always co-viewed with a caregiver. 2 to 5 years of age, no more than 1 hour a day. Again, focus on high quality educational content and co-viewing or co-playing, so that at least it has those relational benefits. Um, Being prepared, my second bit of advice. Going out to eat or the grocery store or on a road trip, be prepared with non-screen entertainment or soothing options to keep your child occupied. And this will make it so much easier for you not to rely on a screen in the time of need. It's especially important to avoid using screens and devices to calm an upset child. I know that might go against your instincts, parents, but a child can actually start to build problematic associations and later difficulties with self regulation if you start that and do that too often. If you're allowing screen time, prepare for the transition to ensure that it's a smooth one. So make the stopping point something meaningful,
Hmm.
like the end of an episode or a level in a game, instead of a chunk of time, which
Yeah.
can be harder for children to grasp. But know what activity is next and be ready to move right into it and make it fun. Um, and do some research to identify which shows or apps are high quality and meet your needs and values, instead of just turning on the first show or platform that is recommended for you. My third area of advice, co-view and co-play. And this one is obviously self-explanatory, but watch the shows with your children and play the games or the apps that they're playing. Talk with them about what they're seeing and learning to reinforce the positive, and immediately address any negatives if they pop up. And this can be most challenging because lots of parents may rely on screens when they need to take a break to help
Hmm.
another child or do something around the house or just breathe. So, as much as possible, try to identify some non screen activities that can fill these times and save screen time for when you can be present. At a minimum, make sure you can hear and see what they're watching, even if you're multitasking, so you know immediately if they accidentally stumble onto something they shouldn't. I'll end this section, this answer with you by talking about the 4 pillars of learning. These are really helpful, I think, in also framing your approach to this, parents, when you're thinking about how to support your kids. One is promote active learning from the child, not passive. 2, use engaging learning material and limit unnecessary distractions. 3, be meaningful and relatable to the child's experience and level of understanding. And 4, encourage social interaction around the learning content.
I think you covered it all. I would just add one thing for, and maybe you can give me your thoughts on this, just in terms of choosing content, which I think is the hardest thing. We usually recommend keep it slow and boring and single camera to begin with, right? Like, think the stuff that we grew up on. The epitome of which would be something like Mr. Rogers, right? It's slow, it's boring, they're learning, perfect. Because once you get to that high pace, it's really hard to go back. And then, you're avoiding that high dopamine, which I know we haven't really explained, but I think most people maybe understand that term at least a little bit. Because yeah, it's just so much harder to roll things back as a parent. They're not going to want to watch Mr. Rogers when they've watched Coco Melon already, right?
Yep.
So I
Yep.
don't.
No,
Yeah,
you're really touching on such a great point, and I love that you use Mr. Rogers. For people that don't know who that
yeah,
was, imagine a television show that's not that different than if you were just sitting in your living room visiting with a neighbor.
yeah.
It's a very slow paced, highly relational, interactive show that's very much focused on relationships and
Mhm.
the importance of human relationships and respect and dignity. And I think if you're looking at your own values as a parent and then you're looking at content, try to match your values with the content so that you're not putting something in front of the child that you would never want to be exposed to,
Yeah,
that you would expose your child to.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So let's talk about video games, which I know is actually the subject of your next webinar, which is in March. So, what are the pros and cons of video games for children based on the latest research on the subject? So now we're maybe going a little bit older, maybe elementary aged and above.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for mentioning the Ask the Experts webinar in March. I really encourage your listeners to check that out so they can hear more directly from the experts themselves. That's one of the goals at Children and Screens, by the way, is to provide resources to the public based on direct expert input
Yeah.
so they can share the latest research and clinical evidence directly with parents.
Mhm.
And that said, it can be really challenging to talk about video games because honestly, it's such a broad and diverse category.
Yeah.
Speaking generally, some of the positives that have been associated with video games include enhancements to attention and cognitive skills, problem solving, community building, and social relationships, and in some cases, even creativity and identity exploration. But
Mhm.
there are negatives too, and those can be problematic use and addiction, desensitization to violence and aggression, exposure to hate speech and harassment, promotion of gambling like behaviors, and other outcomes of problematic use, such as sleep deprivation, academic difficulties, social isolation, and more. You might expect that there are specific games that are more likely to have either positive or negative outcomes, and this can be true, but modern video games often have different modes of play, even within a single game. And so it's often difficult to know for sure what your child's using. And so you have to be aware that you have to consider specific characteristics of the game or game play, as well as the unique considerations for individual player. By looking at specific dimensions of play, such as the amount of play, the content of the game, the context of play. Is it solo? Is it multiplayer? The various structures and mechanics of the game, and the unique developmental needs of your child, who is the player. And it's important to try to better understand how certain games played a certain way and by certain people may be more likely to have either positive or negative effects. So as I said early on, it's a complicated area because it's such a big category. But let me talk a little bit about some of the examples from research that might help your parents whose kids are all very unique and special.
Mhm.
Game structures and mechanics. So how information is portrayed on the screen environment, how closely physical gameplay mimics the real experience can impact cognitive and perceptual skills. For example, research has found benefits of action video games due to these features. The gaming context, for example, whether it's solo or multiplayer, may affect the impact of violent or pro-social content with the influence of social cognitions. So you also see how some of these dimensions interact with each other to alter effects. So to learn more, attend our webinar in March to learn from the experts themselves.
Yeah. I mean, a couple things, you talked about modes of play. I mean, you're probably familiar with like a game like Minecraft, for example, very popular. In the creative mode, it can actually be quite beneficial. They're just building, it's, creative, like it sounds. But when you jump into the survival mode, now you're getting the chat, now you're getting the collecting, you're getting a wide open metaverse without clear stopping points. You mentioned clear stopping points earlier in the context of TV. Super important. We teach that to parents all the time, that the clear stopping points are going to be much easier to manage with games as well, right? Turn it off after this level or after this world or whatever. Um, so, I mean, we could maybe use that one as example. Is that what you had in mind? Like something like Minecraft where it has those two different modes available?
Yes, exactly. I mean, thank you for using that example because most parents can probably relate to that. They
Yeah.
probably have been asked to purchase Minecraft or you may already
Yep.
have it. And it really is like a games within the game.
Yes.
And so be very alert and educate yourself about these different modes and what may have beneficial impacts and negative impacts depending on which mode your child's in. And depending on the age of your child, that single player mode, could be truly problematic because of its access to the metaverse. Whereas the creative mode, where you're building worlds, it has proven to be, it can have beneficial impacts. So, thank you for making that distinction.
Yeah. And, we do, kids, parents are always looking for, well, what do I do? What are the rules of thumb? And tell me if you agree with this. But we usually advocate for the younger kids, like more closed platforms. So think a game like the Switch, you put it in, you play it, there's a clear level, you're done, right? You're not chatting, there's no social media element, there's no social comparison, whatever. Where games like, I don't know, Fortnite, that's super popular, right? Has a social media component. There's public display of your skins, your points, etc. And then there's in-app purchases, which adds to the dopamine elevation that we've talked about earlier. So it's almost like you mentioned modern video games. Many modern video games have social media hidden inside, which I think most parents don't really understand. But a really simple way, I think, rule of thumb could be connected, not connected, right? Like not connected for younger
Mhm.
kids. Maybe the older kids might be more ready for those experiences. What do you think about that?
I think it's also that you're bringing up more of the complicating factors of video games. There
Yeah.
is a very big social network. When many people play, they play multiplayer and they're connected through a headset and through the game itself. And that can have both positive and negative opportunities embedded in it. There are also, I love the fact that you brought up loot boxes and other kinds of challenges that occur in the game that can lead to bigger problems later on, that mimic gambling behaviors
Yeah.
or sort of taking too many risks. And the consequences aren't necessarily in quotes real, but then they are real. And so we really, really cannot emphasize enough how important it is to understand what the game is your child's playing, how connected is it to the internet, and how can you wall off that multiplayer option depending on the age of your child in the
Yeah.
rules you have.
Okay. Those are good rules of thumb. So let's jump to social media. We touch on it a little bit. So, what do the latest studies show regarding the correlation between social media and youth mental health? I know we have the Surgeon General's advisory as well, which we could talk about, but maybe you can speak to the studies.
I'd love to. This is an area of just, there's so much interest in this, and there are stories in the media every day. And as you say, government leaders and educators are really speaking out on this crisis, essentially, of the youth mental health crisis. And so it's really complicated. And there really isn't, there are a number of factors and variables that are at play in the relationship between social media and youth mental health. But it's important to note that as a general concept, social media is not inherently good or bad.
Yeah.
However, there are certain features of social media, in particular patterns of use, that might again be more likely to enhance potential positive or negative effects. So, studies have shown that associations between social media and youth mental health impacts range from increased anxiety, depression, and suicidality to concerns with body image, disordered eating, and self harm, to challenges like upward social comparison, FOMO, fear of missing out, and problematic use and addiction. So, youth with pre existing mental health issues may be more susceptible to more negative patterns of use and associated outcomes. Specific features like the highly visual nature of some platforms and the highlight reels, news feeds that promote idealized depictions of life, quantifiable approval metrics, likes and streaks, filters, and editing tools that enhance unrealistic beauty standards, nudge techniques that keep youth engaged frequently, the endless source of content with infinite scroll, and algorithmic driven recommendations that push content designed to grab your attention. These features all enhance those negative outcomes I mentioned by exacerbating the youth mental health crisis we're seeing today. So, exposure to negative experiences like cyberbullying, hate speech, and discrimination or inappropriate content, which might be violence, sex, alcohol, drugs, self harm, can all exacerbate mental health issues. Some
Hmm.
new research, however, has found that there are sensitive periods for these negative effects, and they're different between boys and girls. So it seems that girls may be more susceptible to this negative link at ages 11 to 13.
Hmm.
And boys are a little older, between ages 14 and 15. So both boys and girls experience another sensitive period around 19 years of age. So I'll talk about a few more studies that are also showing that youth rely on social media to stay connected.
Hmm.
That their friends are incredibly important and they're seeking social support. They want to build community. They want to explore and refine their own individual identity. So, and that's really particularly true for marginalized groups of youth, such as Black or Latinx or LGBTQ plus youth, and particularly for those who would otherwise be isolated in a local community. And studies have found that youth are leveraging social media platforms for creative expression, civic engagement, and even learning. So there are connections that social media can offer that are really positive. But keep in mind, if you have a child that may already be susceptible or experiencing a mental health crisis or challenge, that the social media can have a negative impact. But if they're not experiencing that, it may actually provide them with some opportunities.
I think what you said right there is the simplest way I think parents can look at it, because there, with all technology, there's pros and cons. But it's really the pre-existing condition thing that you touched on, because as far as I know, social media doesn't cause mental health issues, right? Like there's no evidence. But if you're going into it with a little bit of anxiety, a little bit of depression, a little bit of a body image issue, its job is to sort of amplify, your experience as a human. So you are going to receive more and more of that content. It's going to create that echo chamber, et cetera. So I think that's a really important and simple way of looking at it, because I think sometimes as parents, like, my son's very sensitive to media, and I'll talk to another parent about it and they'll look at me like I'm nuts, like my child doesn't react that way. What are you talking about? But he's one of these kids that has a quote unquote pre-existing condition. He's going into it with maybe a little bit of anxiety every day, right?
Mm.
So I think that's a really good simple rule of thumb, because this does get really complicated, and people react differently to it. So that's great. Okay, so lastly, we've touched on maybe a little bit of this throughout our time, but what are your main tips for parents that are navigating the introduction of modern screen tech? And this can go across kids of across all stages of development. So we talked about like pacing media a little bit. We talked about kind of video games light and video games, extreme. So maybe elaborate a little bit more on tips.
I'd love to, and this is a great place to wrap up because I think it is, we can roll all of this up into basically a twofold recommendation. Number one, establish a plan.
Yeah.
And number two, keep your lines of communication open, right? This is a fluid process. Your child's getting older, their needs are changing, their development is active. You have to be prepared to make adjustments and also communicate with them about their changing needs. So, we like to recommend a tool that the American Academy of Pediatrics developed. They call it the Family Media Plan. You can also just do this on your own. First thing you do is decide what your goals and values and intentions are when it comes to tech use. You do it in advance of introducing new either equipment or software or experiences by helping the child make those decisions with you in advance. Some general boundaries and rules you should pre-establish, such as where are our screen-free times
Hmm.
and screen-free zones. Set those basic ground rules around behavior with devices, screen time expectations, etc., right up front. With younger children, you might consider some parental controls or filters to protect against unwanted content, but don't expect these to work. Kids are really good at getting around them, but it's worth a try. For older children, it's important to really get them involved. What rules do they recommend? What should happen if they break those rules? Um, and be sure to revisit that plan. As I said, it's a really dynamic time, child development. It's practically things can change on a daily basis almost. And you want to make sure that you're checking in on their media use and how things are working for them. Maybe even go back to that agreement that you established up front on a semi-regular schedule to make sure that it's still meeting everybody's needs.
Yeah, I love that. I've talked to so many experts, and having a plan is one of the things that I hear over and over. And it sounds so simple, but I think most families don't do it. And it is a little bit of work in the beginning, right? And I'm glad you gave that tool that kind of helps serve as a guideline. But I can't tell you how much headache it will save if you actually do go in with a plan, because it almost becomes a little bit of a contract. Like you said, it can be fluid, but at least, as a parent, if your kid's pushing back or whatever, you can kind of say, hey, we had an agreement. This is our plan. And maybe there'll be opportunities to adjust the plan, but it kind of takes it off of having to make real-time decisions every day, right? I mean, it's an investment, but it'll pay off. And then I
It
think,
sets the floor for
yeah,
sure. And then you can have those conversations about, well, so then what else would we do? So that you're bringing part of your plan is communication and checking in. So if
mhm,
there seems to be conflict, you say, "Up, we said we would talk about the plan more if we ended up in a situation where we didn't agree anymore." So you have to tie the two together. The plan and communication, they're sort of, they're very interdependent in terms
yeah.
of making sure they're successful.
And like you said, being fluid is so important because kids develop at different stages. You might have a really mature, I don't know, 13-year-old, and you might have one that, isn't anywhere near ready for even talking about, I'm just going to throw out smartphone as an example. So, I think parents should and be able to adapt, number one. Number two, I hear all the time from parents in our parent eds that have maybe gone somewhere they didn't want to go, right? Maybe they introduced a video game they didn't work, or anything, social media. I mean, I don't know if you agree with this, but we always let them know that it's okay to roll things back. It's okay to try things. And if they don't work, say, you know what, we made a mistake. Or maybe there's some new research that came out that you can share with your child, right? That
Yeah,
helps explain.
that would be great.
Yeah.
Yes,
So
research can be helpful in that way.
yeah, so I
I
think
mean,
being
it really all of these things. There's like a when you're really thinking about this across all parenting challenges, right? That it's active. It's active mentoring, it's active support, it's active mediation. And the social media, digital media aspect of your lives is really no different as challenges present themselves. You have to have that open channel of communication. And if you could introduce more evidence at some point because you came to a webinar or you
yeah.
listened to a podcast and you can say, "Hey, I want to talk about this new research I heard about vulnerable periods in adolescence. I didn't know anything about this. The girls 11 to 13 are a little bit more vulnerable than they are when they're older. And you're 12.
Yeah.
It really allows you to apply the research in your real life in a way that the child might even have sort of their own aha moment, which is what you're trying to do as a parent, is scaffold the inner strength of the child so that they're taking more control inward and guiding their own development. If everything's coming from you and you're pushing down all of the guidance, you're going to be exhausted, number one.
Yeah.
And, there's sort of a relentless pushback. But if they start to feel like it's good for them and they want to feel good, then you've really accomplished something.
Yeah, I mean, knowledge is power. And I don't think we give kids enough credit if you give them the information, even if it's something as complicated as a study. Hey, this study came out and it shows a negative correlation with body image. Not only are they smart enough to understand it, I mean, obviously, if they're in the right age, but it also, as a parent, gives you like a third party validation. You're not just on your soapbox saying, this is bad for you. No, this is steeped in science. We have evidence. And I think that's so powerful. And I mean, that brings me back to like just thanking you for what you're doing at Children and Screens, because you guys are filling in that gap, in many areas that maybe need more research as well. So
Yeah.
I so appreciate your time, Kris. I know you're super busy. Thank you so much. And I can't wait I'm going to check out the webinar in March myself on video games.
Oh, great. And please visit our website. We just launched a new website that takes volumes of research and makes them very easily accessible. We've structured it so you can ask us questions on the website and get answers quickly. So childrenscreens.org is another resource for you parents, in addition to the podcast. Thanks for having me.